All right. So, when I was working on Daniel 11, I've got my book out, published by the Review, and are you going to try, does this pick up me on this one or not? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, and our book has come out. I've been working full-time on Daniel 11 for about 5 or so months, full-time. I'd quit being a pastor and was doing this. And I went to a symposium on Daniel 11. My book had stirred up some interesting comments, let's say. And there were 3 of us, each spent a day presenting and defending our viewpoint. 3 different viewpoints on Daniel 11. And they all pretty much ganged up on me. And they had a question. To illustrate the question, if we have Arab Islam and the Crusades, the first conflict, and then after the Crusades, Ottoman Islam, verses 29 to 39, that means verse 29 would have to be somewhere around the 1400s. All right? There's a problem. Most historicists see verse 31 as being 508. How could you be around 1400 in verse 29? There was the challenge that they were throwing up at me. Now, that has to do with an understanding of the 1290 and the 1335. And I will admit to you that I'd looked at what most historicists say on that, being 508, the beginning of that time, and it was the best I heard, but I have to tell you, it wasn't that strong in my opinion. It's what the Millerites had taught, but it just didn't seem very strong to me. And what I'd found in Daniel 11 seemed stronger, but I will just tell you that I got hit at that symposium and in another one, and I hit the Christmas break, which is from Thanksgiving to the first of the year. You don't do public seminars between Thanksgiving and the first of the year. They just don't go that well. All right? And so I was home, and I said, Lord, I don't care what you have to do. I want to know the truth of this. I need an answer. I've got a gut feeling it deals with the 1290 and the 1335, and I need to understand. Up until this point, I had gone to Daniel 12 seminars or symposiums, but they didn't have anything better than I had. And at this point, when I finally said, okay, Lord, I'm all in, show me. It was amazing. Within a couple of days, the answer started coming. Up until that time, I'd always thought it was probably a little too hard to understand. And as long as you think it's too hard to understand, it will be too hard for you to understand because you won't work on it very hard. All right? And in this case, I told the Lord, I'll pull the book. I'll do anything. I just want to know the truth. And here's what I found. In Daniel 11, you have 3 times mentioned. You have the king of the north will be in power for a time, the appointed time, and the time of the end. I noticed something else. Every vision comes along, and if there's going to be a time element, it is not given in the vision, it's given in the additional information or interpretation afterwards. So you're going to the vision is the what, then in the interpretation or additional information, you get the when. Well, that worked in Daniel's 2, 7, and 8. So when you look at Daniel 11, you get the what, verse 2 through 12:4, if that's the case and the pattern's the same, you'll get the when after words and the additional information. And that's exactly what happens again. Daniel is consistent in his patterns. This is one of the things that's valuable about studying this same chapter repeatedly for year after year. You start getting well immersed in patterns. And so we find this in 12:5 and following. And in verse 6, it says, "And one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, 'How long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be?'" The wonders are Daniel 11:2 through 12:4. Now he's asking the how long question. In Daniel 8, he asked the how long question, "How long will the vision be?" And he was given 2,300 evenings and mornings. Does this make sense? You ask the how long question, you get the how long answer. So we had the first time period is for a time. And what's the first how long answer? Well, this is tied to verse 23. "And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people, but only for a time." 12:7, the first how long answer, "That it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished." Now, I'd always believed that the power that came into place in Daniel 11:23 would be in power for 1,260 years. Why? Because that's what the little horn is in Daniel 7. And I believe them to be one and the same. But now when it dawns on me, that's exactly what 12 is saying, that this power would be in power for time, times, and half a time, or 1,260 years. So that's really pretty simple. The first time period is that the papal power would be from 538 to 1798. All right, that matches everything I've heard. And that's what matched what I had in my book, as far as the papacy and King of the North, little horn, all being the same thing, and the beast of Revelation. The big question was the appointed time, where I thought the appointed time and the Ottomans should come right about in here at the end of the Crusades, but as the Ottomans and Reformation are coming in. And then I noticed something. It actually talks more about the Reformation than it does the Ottomans between verse 29 and 39. More about the Reformation and God's people. All right. Here's where the verse shows up. "At the appointed time, he, the king of the north, shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter." There's your three conflicts. But this is called the appointed time. That would indicate that there should be a time prophecy there. I didn't know of any time prophecy for the Reformation or the Ottomans. Well, if Daniel 12 is giving me the times of 11, I can go look for that in 12, but I also did something else. I decided that I should go back to the first time Daniel mentions the term appointed time. Anytime you run into a challenge in the Bible, go back and look at the first time that term is used by a writer. Because just like you, they will often explain it the first time they mention it. And sure enough, Daniel does. It's in Daniel 8:19. "Look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time, the end." And the word "shall be" are supplied by the translators. So, the appointed time, the end. Well, Daniel 11:29 sure wasn't the end when Jesus comes. It's the end of what? If you have a time prophecy, the time prophecy is pointing to an event typically at the end. What prophecy ends in verse 29. Time prophecy. It's going to be a point in time, but it's also the latter time of the indignation. So it's both a point of time and a period of time? That's an interesting one. I looked up what is the appointed time and the indignation in the commentaries, and most commentaries said little or nothing about it, which means they didn't know. All right. Now, you look at the use of the appointed time in Daniel 11, you have verse 27, you have the appointed time is future. You go a few verses, verse 29, the appointed time is now present. You go a few more verses to 35, the appointed time is future again. In a sequential book, how can the appointed time be future, present, future? I went to Daniel 12. What's the next time prophecy? It's the 1290 and 1335. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Oh, so this is really easy. All you have to do is find the abomination of desolation, run 1290 and 1335, and you should have it. Except there are two abominations of desolation in the writings of Daniel. Now, if I'd have been thinking very clearly on the first little bit, that would have been simple. Why? If you have two beginning points, you're going to have how many ending points? Two. It's going to be future, present, future. It's got two ending points. It's got two beginning points. Well, the first one is in Daniel 9:27. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So 9:27, you have the abomination that makes desolate. And so I knew I had to answer the question, this is not really the abomination of desolation, is it? This is the abomination that makes desolate. So I decided to have fun with that one. I went and presented this at a Daniel 12 seminar right after I'd figured it out. And I knew that I was going to get jumped on. Because, you make your presentation, at the end of it, they're going to go after you, right? And so I decided that I wanted to make the first question kind of hurt them when they ask it, to make them a little friendlier afterwards. And so I said, I know this is the abomination that desolates, but I know this Bible commentator that I always trust that says this is the abomination of desolation. I didn't name my Bible commentator intentionally. And as soon as I did it, I was watching the group, and there was one guy that started getting a little antsy right away, and I knew he wanted to know who this Bible commentator was. And it was one of the guys that I knew would go after me. I thought, okay, this is going to be fun. And I got to the end of it, and got the questions. His hand goes up, and I pointed to him. I said, yes, what's your question? Who's this Bible commentator that you always agree with? I had the slide ready. I said, Jesus, Matthew 24. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then that those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jesus is calling Daniel 9:27 Daniel's abomination of desolation. If Jesus can say it, so can I. I mean, that is the one Bible commentator that I have learned to never disagree with. And they were a little carefuler on their questions after that. And it was literally fulfilled by the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Oh, so I have a date, 70 A.D. And it brings an end of sacrifice, because when the temple is destroyed, Jesus brings an end of sacrifice when he is killed, but the king of the power, or Rome, brings it in 70 A.D. Well, Jesus goes on. He then gives it, by the way, a global application. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days would be shortened. How many abominations of desolation are there? 2. One where the place gets taken down, the other one when God's people are attacked. That's just like Daniel having 2 abominations of desolation. Find out they are the same. Jesus got it from Daniel just like he said he did. Well, if we take 70 A.D. and run 1,290 years, it brings you to 1360. Boy, I can remember the day I did that math. It was like, whew, it's right at the end of the Crusades. It's where I was hoping it would be. Maybe I'm not going to have to recant my book. But what happened in 1360? Was there anything to do with the Ottomans or maybe even the Reformation? Here's where computers come in handy. 1360. 1360 and 1361, John Wycliffe is just coming into power, into positions. John Wycliffe. He's known as the morning star or theoretician of the Reformation. Let's see. Would John Wycliffe have anything to do with the Ottoman Empire or the Reformation? Definitely the Reformation, and that's what's talked about more in this section than the Ottomans, actually. Okay, that's interesting. Now I want to know what 1335 would do. So let's take a look at the 1335. That brings you to 1405, when John Huss becomes the first practicing reformer. Let's see. The theoretician of the Reformation, first practicing reformer. That's what historians called him. So yeah, you've got the beginnings of the Reformation. In here, you've got kind of the introduction to the Reformation. And by 1453, the Ottomans are taking Constantinople. During this time period, the Ottomans and the Reformation are coming into position. Wow. That was cool. I thought I'd discovered something that nobody had ever seen before. And one snowy, very cold Sabbath afternoon, I was home in Idaho, and I curled up by my wood stove. And I thought, I'm just going to read on this Sabbath afternoon. What do I want to read? Well, it's me. I have this bookcase over there, and there's this set of three or four books called Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers. Talks about prophecy and history. Sounds like good, relaxing reading to me. I grab a book and start leafing through it. And bam! There's a guy by the name of William Hale in the 1830s who is teaching this. I thought I'd discovered something new. Nope. He was actually a Millerite preacher. And but because it didn't point to the 1800s, the rest of the Millerites ignored what he had to say on this part. That was interesting. This is the same guy who did the work to really prove out 27 AD, 31 AD, 34 AD for the end of the 70th, the 70 weeks, or 490-year prophecy. So he's not a nobody in the study of prophecy. So that gives me a beginning point. In the book Great Controversy, written by E.G. White, who was also from the Millerite movement, look what is said. Except among the Waldenses, the word of God had for ages been locked up in languages known only to the learned, but the what? Time had come. As if there's some kind of time prophecy. Now this, she would have known of William Hale, all right? For the scriptures to be translated and given to the people of different lands in their native tongue. Oh, this is referencing Wycliffe. Second paragraph in the chapter on Wycliffe. The world had passed its midnight, the hours of darkness were wearing away, and in many lands appeared tokens of the coming dawn. Had the dawn actually come yet with Wycliffe? Nope. But it's tokens of the coming dawn. It's the light is beginning to come, but you don't have the sunrise yet. Where was the sunrise? Huss. Talking about Huss and Jerome. So perish God's faithful light bearers, but the light of the truths which they proclaim could not be extinguished. As well might men attempt to turn back the sun in its course as to prevent the dawning of that day which was even then breaking upon the world. You get the morning star with Wycliffe. You get the break of dawn with Huss. By the way, in 1405, Huss was teaching from the writings of Wycliffe in the University of Prague. And the Pope sent out a decree to the bishop overseeing that area, silence Huss. And so they told Huss, you've got to stop preaching or teaching the writings of Wycliffe. And for a little bit, he thought he would obey the church because he'd been sworn to follow and obey the church. And then he thought, no, I have a higher duty to Jesus and the Bible. And what happens? He becomes the first practicing reformer. And by 1415, 10 years later, he's burned at the stake. The period in between is the introduction to the Reformation. Keep that in mind. That becomes very, very interesting once we get the second set of dates. Let's go to that second set. The abomination of desolation of Daniel 11:31. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation until the time of the end. Now, you'll notice there's a note there at the bottom, disjunctive for 11:31 to 35. I am no Hebrew expert, but I was presenting at a Daniel 11 conference in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and I was going to present on this part of it, and God kept me up most of the night as I was wrestling with some issues. And I can remember finally all of the pieces came together, and I said, oh, good. Lord, can I go to sleep now? I start going to sleep, and bam, a whole new aspect of it hits me. Oh, no. In the morning, I walked in and asked Conrad Vine, I said, can I change my presentation? He's the chair of the group that was leading out. I said, the Lord kept me up all night, and I need to change it. And he said, okay. About then, a guy by the name of Roy Gain walked in. He's a literally world-class languages expert. Very few people in the world would argue with him. And he was walking in, and I walked over to Roy, and he didn't know what was hanging on this question, but everything I'd put in the place overnight depended on his answer. I said, Roy, is Daniel 11:31 conjunctive or disjunctive, Vav? And you're going, so what? If it's conjunctive, it means it's in series, the verb forms. If it's disjunctive, it means there's a break. If it's conjunctive, everything I've learned overnight in figuring this out doesn't fit the text, and the text is king. I've got to go with the text. And Roy goes, oh, it's disjunctive. Why? I said, thanks, Roy. You'll find out in the presentation. I went ahead with everything I'd learned overnight. And because there's a break, and it's going to be really interesting to see what's going on. So what happens is he gets down to the beginning of the Reformation and the Ottomans, and then he takes a break, and he steps back in time, gives you another date, and he's going to establish the end of the time period now. From 508, when the papacy gets the force of arms, it brings you to 1798. Oh, that's the French King Clovis. And then from 508, 1335 brings you down to 1843. But it's kind of like a school year. It's kind of part in 43 and part in 44. So what does that do for us? The appointed time is an end point, but it's also the latter part of the indignation. If you remember Daniel 8:19. So you take a look at this. You have, from the inside two lines, it's the latter part of the 1260, which was an indignation against God's people. They're being persecuted. But if you go from the black lines, it's the latter part of the 2300 days, which is an indignation because God's temple is being blasphemed or trashed. And it's got to be made right. And so either way you cut it, it matches it. Now, you have an introduction to the Reformation here, but between 1798 and 1843, you have an introduction to the time of the end. Because from the second one, it will bring you to the time of the end. And that's what works. Also, notice this. During this time period, you're having the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Reformation. During this time period, they're strong, and during this time period, the Ottoman Empire is in decline and falling, and the Reformation is in decline and falling because they accept the counter-Reformation teachings on prophecy. And so between those black lines, you have the rise and fall of both the Ottomans and the Reformation. Before it, you have the first conflict. After it, you have the time of the end third conflict. And by giving the bookends to this center one, Daniel just put all three of them in the location of time. Crusades before it, time of the end after the appointed time. So that was really helpful for me. Now, I want you to notice something. Daniel will sometimes give you overlapping statements. He's typically sequential, but once in a while, with clues given, he will give you an overlap. But there's always something in the text to tell you. In Daniel 11 and 12, we have 11, verses 44 and 45, the king of the north, the tidings, the loud cry is given. The king of the north goes out to attack God's people, but the papacy comes to its end. In Daniel 12, you get an overlap. When the papacy goes out to attack God's people, the judgment ends when Michael stands up to protect God's people. There's a time of trouble like there never was. The papacy ends at the same time Jesus is delivering his people. And in Daniel 12, he goes At that time, Michael stands up. At that time, there's a time of trouble like there never was. At that time, God's people are delivered. So he's got the phrase "at that time" to tell you it's at the same time this is happening, and as soon as you go past the overlap, he stops using the phrase "at that time." So he's given a clue right in the text that he's got a little something going on. This time, you get the literal, localized fulfillments of Daniel. All the way up through verse 30, it is very localized. It's what's happening in the Mediterranean area and Jerusalem. As soon as you go by this one, verse 30, the end of the conflict of the Battle of Lepanto, which is a Mediterranean conflict, he then gives you the vav disjunctive. There's a break in the story, and he now takes a look at it at another way, and it is now when the papacy has the force of arms, and this time his focus is on how they go global in their persecution against God's people. 70 AD was a localized, the 1260 is a globalized kind of thing and following. And so you now have the globalized one starting from 508 for the starting period, and it brings us down here, and the persecution in particular goes global. Now, what about the time of the end? The appointed time was the tough one with the 1290 and 1335. But that then has come together. So what about the time of the end? There is no time aspect given in 11 or 12 for the time of the end. There didn't need to be, because God had already given it in Daniel chapter 8. Here's what it says. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? I want to stop there for a moment. Who destroyed the sanctuary? Rome did in 70 AD. But then the papacy, over time, attacks God's people. There's your two abominations, even there. Once you see it, it's scattered all over the place. Goes on, and he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. If you keep reading, you find this. Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. It's not the vision of the 1260 that refers to the time of the end. It's the vision of the 2,300 that refers to the time of the end. Well, that would bring us down to 1844. But remember, that second set was to bring us down to the time of the end, and 1843-44 is just there in line with now you have the time of the end in 1844. You have the introduction to the time of the end. All the players are put in place. The papacy gets its deadly wound. It's now going to start its resurgence. Revelation 13, the ally of the papacy, the United States, is coming into play from 1798 to 1844. The French Revolution is changing over to Marxist socialism and the radical left between 1798 and 1844. And Islam goes down in here and begins its resurgence. By the time you hit 1844, the four players are in position. At any time, God could let the winds blow, and we could have the end of time and the coming of Jesus. Everything was in place at that point. Now, I was just mentioning that, so let's look at reasons that 1844 is the time of the end. Number one, Daniel 8 implies that, or states that. It would be, refers to the time of the end. Number two, we're told in Daniel 12:14 4 and 9, that it was sealed until the time of the end. Well, in Daniel 8:26, the 2,300 days were sealed. Were those understood in the 1798 or 1844? The Millerites had it wrong. They didn't get it figured out until 1844. So if it's sealed until 1844, that would be another additional piece that's when it is understood. 3, Daniel 11:35 and 12:9 and 10, there is a link between being made white with the time of the end. Well, that's the same as Daniel 8's cleansing of the sanctuary. And when are our records made white or cleaned up by Jesus? During the heavenly judgment beginning in 1844 in preparation for Christ's return. Oh, so that fits now. The seventh trumpet or third woe of Revelation 11 is while the dead are being judged. That matches. Here's just a simple logic one, but boy, it's an important piece of logic. If the time of the end is when Jesus comes, after 1844, Jesus can now come at any moment, so we are in the time of the end. He couldn't come before the judgment, but once the judgment starts, there's nothing in there that say how long it will take for the judgment. The judgment could be a few minutes long as far as that is concerned, and he could be done. So anytime after it starts, Jesus could return. So if that is true, we are living in the time of the end. It couldn't have been in 1840, but it could have been in 1844. So that's interesting. So I come to the simple conclusion then that we have the appointed time from 1360 to 1843-44, and you have the Crusades before it, the time of the end conflict after it, the rise and fall of the Reformation and the Ottomans. It's interesting. In Daniel 11, he links the Reformation and the Ottomans. And you study their time periods, and yep, they're right there together. And so this ties it all together for me. You take a look at this. The 1290, 1335 fit in, the 1260, the 2300 days. It all ties together in one picture in harmony with the statements of Daniel 11. And I'd never had all those time prophecies have anything that link them all together before. And for somebody like me that's really into studying prophecy, that was exciting. And to quit having the loose ends. You see, when you just looked at 508 to 1790 and 1843, it seemed like for all practical purposes, the Millerites looked at the dates they wanted it to be and went looking for an event to start it. And I was just wondering, how solid is that? Did they get the right event? But once I had this one, and then this one, and it tied everything together and made sense with the text, now I had additional information to solidify it for me. And so I started out actually not so sure about 508. But by the time I was done, I'm now quite sure about it because it fits the whole thing together. So I'm going to see, do any of you have any questions you want to ask before I move to another piece of this? Yes, good.
One thing that's always bothered is Daniel 8:14, foundational verse, is, and I like you believe that Daniel shows his words very carefully. And he did use the word yom for day. And I know you know this. And so I've always wondered, why did he choose evenings and mornings instead of day? Because if you use the Bible as its own dictionary, you go back to Genesis chapter 1, an evening and a morning is a day, not a year. And so,
Yeah.
I'm not a naysayer on the application, but I see manifold applications to these things. And anyway, I just wondered if you've ever thought about that.
All right. So I'm going to restate it in short. He uses terms evenings and mornings, and that reminds you of creation where it's evenings and the mornings were the first day, the third, representing a day. And so he's still not trying to get rid of the understanding of the 2,300 days and the judgment, but creates questions. Interestingly, possibly a part of this is that the theme of Daniel 8 is the sanctuary service. And so you have a round of evening and morning sacrifices. And so he might be using a sanctuary phrasing for days, because in Daniel 7 you have unclean animals. Daniel 8 you have clean animals. Daniel 7 has a courtroom scene. It's more of a secular themed way of looking at it. Daniel 8 is a Day of Atonement, sanctuary themed judgment scene. And so Daniel 8 is more sanctuary based, so that could be a reason for it as well. I don't have all the answers on that. Okay, that's just, I'll come back in a little bit to, I think, part of what you're wondering about as you carry that out. Okay?
And just kind of a follow-on on 2,300. And I noticed this a long time ago, and I haven't quite figured it out, but if 7 years somehow figures in. I mean, there's this last week of the 490. And I'm not a futurist, I'm not saying that, but I do see this 7-year time period showing up like in the prophecies of Joseph. And I mean, all these things were given to point forward to something at the end.
Okay.
And so, anyway, you take 7 years, that's 2520. The difference between 2520 and 2300 is 200 and, excuse me, it's, 220 days. And the time, the difference between that winds up to be 7 months and 10 days, which takes you right to the sanctuary cleansing day.
So,
I'm just wondering, I mean, there's a time, there's a Day of Atonement built right into that prophecy, when you look at that in the context of a 7-year period. So, anyway, I'm still
yeah.
scratching this out.
And
There's something about 2,300 that gets to that.
he's just saying there might be more here than has met the eye so far.
Yes.
And I will just say this. When I started my full-time ministry on Daniel 11, I shuddered to think how little I know compared to now. I've probably forgotten more since I started this ministry than I knew at that time. But here's the neat thing. God takes you where you are and works with that. Don't ever be afraid of what you don't know. Just work with what God has given you. All right? We had a question back here. A translation issue on evenings and mornings? No. That's pretty solid. It's evenings and mornings. I think that sometimes it is a translation issue. Oh, by the way, I mentioned for Daniel 8:19, where it says the end, and then the words shall be are added. If you're looking at a King James or New King James, whenever there are added words, they put them in italics. And that's quite useful. Just remember, italics doesn't mean more important in King James and New King James. It means less important. It's added by the translator. Just keep that in mind, and it's very useful.
Can I make a comment about the question? Daniel was told to seal up the book so that it wasn't for his time. And Daniel 8:14, just by itself, I think you do have a hard time and saying that that's 2,300 years just by itself. But it's clearly linked in Daniel 9
Yeah.
to the 70-week prophecy.
That's a good possibility as well. Just keep in mind that he said it wouldn't be understood till the time of the end. You're going to have to get by here before you hit understanding. The 2,300 days, they made a major mistake. They said, well, Jesus is coming in clouds. That means he's coming to the earth. The Millerites. Good question. The Millerites said, Jesus must be coming to the earth. He's coming in clouds in Daniel 7 and 8. If you go read it, he's going to the Ancient of Days. Does the text matter? They fudged the text a little bit. He's coming in clouds. That means he's coming to the earth. The text said he's going to the Ancient of Days. Did that cause them any problems? The great disappointment? Yeah, that's a major problem, okay? Be careful. Don't knowingly bend the text to what you want it to say. What I was doing with Roy Gain, I was willing to put everything aside depending on which answer he gave me. Is that a vav disjunctive or a vav conjunctive? And I really don't like grammar, and never did, even in English. But it is still what it is. And I'm going to stick with what the text is. And that has been very, very useful over the years for me. Okay, got another question.
Well, can I just say one more thing? The Jews were applying a day for a year to the 2,300-day prophecy as much as 1,000 years before William Miller ever said that. And so this was not something that originated. Some people today say, oh, William Miller couldn't know and he didn't have enough Hebrew knowledge and all this kind of stuff. But even the Jews who had plenty of Hebrew knowledge and the Jewish rabbis were saying, we're applying that year to a day to the 2,300. There was a rabbi in the year 1444 who applied a day for a year to that, and he predicted Jesus was coming in 1850.
1850.
Yeah. Or not Jesus, he predicted it.
The Messiah would be.
The Messianic age would begin.
Yeah. There were multiple people early on that were doing things. Just like Wesley was saying that about time for the second beast of Revelation to show up because the first one had been around about long enough now. Because it's going to receive a deadly wound. In 1754, just 44 years before the papacy gets taken down, he's saying it's about time. There were people that were using this and figuring it out. Okay. Got two questions. We'll go here and then across.
Well, just to comment on that, I understood that Martin Luther, even
Yeah.
in his writings, that he figured Jesus was going to come in about 300 years.
Yeah, he had a Jesus in the mid-1800s.
Yeah, so he saw that prophecy too.
Yeah, that was happening. That was Martin Luther. Yes, Jerry?
I'm just curious on the Ottoman Empire. They made it all the way to Vienna, right?
They made it up to around Vienna, yeah.
Okay, so
Yep.
I want to make sure that
Just as I was saying, you get 1405, which is that second one, and by 1453, the Ottomans have taken Constantinople. From the early 1300s through 1450, they were really on the push. They were coming into their power. Yes?
How does the abomination of desolation that was committed by Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, in 165 BC, apply here? And if it's too far off topic, feel free to skip that.
Actually, it's very much on topic. Okay, how does Antiochus Epiphanes fit into this? He doesn't. But it's a really good question for this reason. I need to explain why he doesn't. All right? Because if you go to almost any university in the world and take classes on this time period, they're going to say this all is about Antiochus Epiphanes. Here's what they're going to tell you. Daniel was not written in the 500s BC. It was written around 100 or 200 BC. Well, actually around 100 BC. It wasn't written by Daniel. It was written by somebody claiming to be Daniel. And it was written after Antiochus Epiphanes does his stuff. And it was written as prophecy, but it was really a history. All right? Now, to start out with, there's some new doctoral dissertations that have just come out in the last year that are demonstrating that the book of Daniel was so widely spread at early points in time that its origination being in the 1st or 2nd century BC is not possible. It has to be older. Which is kind of interesting just from the scientific literature studies point. I actually believe it was written by Daniel. But here's the thing. Why would Antiochus Epiphanes not fit? Because in Daniel 11, he starts out very carefully. There are going to be 4 more Persian kings. The fourth one, well, he says 3, and then the 4th will be far richer than them all. By his riches, he will stir up all against the realm of Greece. And Xerxes the Great does exactly that, gathers lots of money, buys lots of mercenary troops, and he marches up to take out Greece. He fails. He returns home, marries Esther. There are 10 or more Persian kings after him before Alexander comes over and takes out Persia. Where are any of those kings in prophecy? They don't fit. As soon as Xerxes the Great loses the Greece, Persia is a has-been. As came up the other night, the question that they are around for a season at a time. They're in now their has-been season at a time fading out stage. You come back to the text. These preterists, as whether it's being taught in these universities, would agree that Daniel 11 verses 14 through 19, thereabouts, or 16 to 19, are talking about Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great. Sends his daughter down south, Cleopatra. She becomes powerful but will not stand with him. That's exactly what she did. He heads west to go after Rome. They send out a general, and they meet, and Antiochus is defeated. Antiochus returns home and is killed by his own people. 5 things in a row. This is what sets off the preterists. They said, you can't be that accurate in a prophecy. It has to be history. Excuse me? We're talking God here. All right? And if it is God can't be so accurate in prophecy, how can I write a book in 2011 and now it's happening? I think Daniel was written before my book. And it's still working to this very day. So I have no problem with it being accurate back then because it still is. But now, if Antiochus the Great, Antiochus Epiphanes' dad, goes down to Rome, what's going to happen to all the Seleucid leaders afterwards? They're not players because Rome is, and actually the next verse fits Rome. You can force it to fit Antiochus, but it's kind of like the Millerites. They were twisting things to make it work. The little horn is supposed to get really big and powerful, right? Antiochus' kingdom kept getting smaller. Antiochus decides he's going to make it bigger, and Antiochus Epiphanes. And he decides he's going to go down and attack Egypt. Rome doesn't want him to. And you're about to see that in Antiochus' day, Rome already controls Antiochus Epiphanes. Because he's taking his army down south. Rome sends a ship over with a general and a couple of men on it. And they meet him out in the desert. And the general says, hey, Antiochus, you better not head on into Egypt. And the Roman general draws a circle around Antiochus. Ever heard of drawing a line in the sand? This is where it came from. He says, by the time you step out of that circle, you had better decide you're going back home. Antiochus turned around and headed back home. Remember, Antiochus had an army with him. The general had a small squad of soldiers with him. But what did Antiochus know? If he did anything to that general and his soldiers, Rome was going to be coming down his throat. He decided to turn around and go back home. Was he getting stronger or weaker? It's not the little horn. There's my answer for that. But it is an answer that if I go into any kind of symposium where we're dealing with secular universities and even most Christian universities outside of the historicist tradition, that's what I'm going to be dealing with. And on my website, there's a paper called The Unmaking of Antiochus Epiphanes, written by Roy Gain under Resources. And it will cover some of what I just said. And plus other things that I didn't remember to say. Okay. Let me just say, it is an adventure when you're dealing with these folks. They have a totally different worldview. You see, in the scholarly world, it's a preterist worldview. Daniel's really not a prophecy. It's a history. In the general Christian view, it's a futurist worldview for Bible prophecy. It's not about the papacy. It's about a bad guy at the end of time. A historicist says, no, just a second. It actually says it starts from the time of Rome and goes all the way to the coming of Jesus. Get an idea why I'm a historicist? I'm saying it starts with Rome. It goes through history all the way to the coming of Jesus. It's not just a future application. It's not just a past application. It is an ongoing application. But there's a problem with an ongoing application. People don't like it. It means it applies to your time right now. And they don't want it to apply to their time because they want to do what they want to do. And if it applies to your time right now, it means God has a truth for you. And most people don't like that. So that's why historicist is the smaller of the three views. But I would argue, from my position, it is the one that matches the text the very best. There was another hand or two. You had a hand to back up.
So you just mentioned again that in the scholarly circles that they teach the preterist, even in the Christian, which preterism, you're speaking about a Christian interpretation. So in my mind, I'm thinking if I was sitting there listening to that lecture, I'd say, well, Jesus named Daniel the prophet by name. So are they saying that Jesus was misled? I mean, it breaks down their whole theology. Discredits even Jesus if they say that Daniel was just had to be written after the fact.
Okay.
We know Jesus wasn't misled.
Did you hear that back there? That if Jesus is quoting from him, Jesus says he's a real prophet. I will just tell you, it doesn't matter what church you're in. You're going to get scholars that get worried about what you would call peer-reviewed material. Do you know what peer-reviewed means? Groupthink. That's what it means. The same problems we're having in science, in medicine, and in theology. And right now, even in Adventist circles, which has been predominantly historicist, there's a growing movement of theologians to dump historicism, and they don't want to go the futurism. They don't want to go the preterism. They want to go to something else. They want to go to idealism. Idealism? Oh, it's just a struggle between good and bad. It can be anything you want it to be. And you laugh about it. I deal with that on a regular basis now. And because I'm sticking to the text very carefully, and in Daniel 11, I know one prominent SDA theologian that at the end of a Zoom presentation that I made, 3 times in the next 2 or 3 minutes said I was high on crack cocaine. After his 3rd shot at that, I finally said, do you have anything to say from the text other than that I'm high on crack cocaine? Because he wasn't one time going to the text. He was just calling me names. And so I just thought I'd try and use his terms. Do you have anything other than saying I'm high on drugs? Do you have anything from the text? Nothing. Be careful of groupthink. I don't care so much if you agree or disagree with me. I mean, it's nice if you agree. But please make sure you're going to the text. And if you're going to the text, it's okay if we have a disagreement. But if you're just going by groupthink or trying to make yourself have a brand new idea by yourself, yeah, I'm not so much. But if you've got a good reason from the text, then we can just talk about it and maybe we'll agree to disagree, but at least we're basing it on the text. All right? Does that make sense?
It's interesting, one of the reasons that William Miller gives in his book for rejecting Antiochus Epiphanes is that he quotes Matthew 24. Jesus said, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, meaning this was something that was coming in the future, not something that had already happened. And that was one of his biggest reasons. And I've never heard any of my Adventist professors ever say that. But this was William Miller's reason for rejecting Antiochus Epiphanes as a choice, because Jesus said, in his time, it's something still coming.
This is down the same line as what I did to those scholars that I knew I was going up against. Not stating who my commentator that I never disagree with was. Folks, if you know the words of Jesus, it gets you a leading head start on lots of things. And if you're really a follower of Jesus, then you really ought to be a follower of Jesus. But a tremendous amount of people aren't. They take the name of Jesus, but they're not really following that. The King of the North, papal-led Christianity, they say they're following Jesus, but they put their traditions over Scripture. That means they're not really following. Lots of people are doing the same thing no matter what faith group they're in today. And if you're putting anything over Scripture, you're probably of the King of the North tradition. What I've told people, if you hate Muslims, you're likely to follow the King of the North all the way to his and your destruction. We got to be careful who we're following and acting like. I'm supposed to be done at what time? Yeah, I was going to say, it's got to be right about now. Thank you. Let's close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thanks for the opportunity of a discussion. And Lord, I ask that your Spirit will continue to lead and guide each one of us. Thank you that we can sharpen each other with your Spirit's guidance from your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Your timekeeping is exceedingly valuable.